There was a small noise from behind. Atsushi turned to see Dazai standing in the doorway. "It's not a good time," Atsushi said, turning back to Akutagawa. Akutagawa looked up, past Atsushi's shoulder to lock eyes with Dazai. "You took everything else from me," he said angrily. "Will you never be satisfied until you have it all?" He stood up and walked to stand directly in front of Dazai. Dazai met Akutagawa's intense gaze without hesitation, his voice steady and calm. "This is not the time for this." Akutagawa laughed. It was the most haunting thing that Atsushi had ever heard. "Oh, yes," he said, still smiling. "I think this is the perfect time." Dazai looked past him to Atsushi's confused expression. "Atsushi, I think we need a moment," he said softly. He smiled sadly as Atsushi nodded his head and stood up slowly. He felt as if he were walking through mud, like the air itself was resisting his movement. He felt Akutagawa's hand as he took his. "No, I think he needs to hear this as well," Akutagawa said, never taking his eyes off of Dazai. He moved his arm around Atsushi's waist and pulled him in closer. Dazai could sense the tension in the air as Akutagawa's arms wrapped around Atsushi, a mix of protectiveness and possessiveness. He knew that this day was coming. He had hoped he had enough time to prepare Atsushi for it better, but now was not the time for regrets. He would just have to have faith that his pupil would be able to handle this. Taking a deep breath, Dazai composed himself and decided to speak, addressing both Akutagawa and Atsushi. "All right then, I'm ready," he said solemnly. Akutagawa pursed his lips once more. "I remember that night in the forest like it was yesterday," he said, looking directly at Dazai. "You said you could give my life purpose. I was so happy. I had found a mentor that would teach me about the world. I found a place in the Port Mafia. You and Jin were all the family I ever needed." He looked away, feeling the emotions he had not allowed himself to feel for years as they bubbled to the surface, threatening to explode. "That last exactly 1 week," he yelled. "Then it was just hell. You would beat me, belittle me, threaten to hurt my sister if I didn't comply." He looked away, trying to hold himself together. "The night before you left, you shot 6 bullets right at my head," he yelled through the tears that now refused to stay hidden. "You said I was useless to you." With that, Akutagawa's resolve was completely broken. Atsushi held onto him tightly, his heart breaking as he stood there and listened, helpless to do anything else. "You said I was useless to you, and then you disappeared." Dazai's face softened as he watched Akutagawa struggle with his emotions. "I'm sore," he started to say, only to be cut off again by his former student. "No. You don't get to apologize." "Not yet," Akutagawa cried. "Then 4 years later, I found you again," he said, his voice lower now. "You came to the rescue of the were-tiger." He looked over at Atsushi and smiled. "I was so confused by the way you treated him," he said, turning his gaze back to Dazai. "You were so gentle, so kind. I had hoped that you would be that for me." Then came another insult. "You told me that your new apprentice was far superior to me." He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, to fend off another rush of tears. "You pitted us against each other, then made us fight together, and through it all, I waited." He looked down at Atsushi's protective arms, wrapped tightly around his waist. "I waited for the day that you would treat me the same way." He shook his head. "It never happened, and I began to resent him for that." He smiled, looking into Atsushi's eyes. "But then, I fell in love with him. I fell in love with him, and I realized that he wasn't the problem, and neither was I. His gaze turned colder as he looked at Dazai again. It was always you. So, I got stronger. On my own. With him. Because he did the one thing you never could. He believed in me. Dazai's expression remained unchanged, betraying no sign of remorse or guilt at Akutagawa's confession. He looked over at Atsushi, trying to gauge his reaction, but it was also impossible, until he raised his head and looked into Dazai's eyes. A look of confusion and sadness filled his entire face. I know that you are not ready to accept an apology from me right now. Perhaps you never will, but time is short. We need to leave now, he said calmly, as he turned and walked back down the corridor. Dazai's words hung heavily in the air, as Atsushi struggled to process the conflicting emotions surging within him. Not since the director died has he been this confused by his feelings. Finally he nodded, giving Akutagawa's hand a little squeeze. Come on, we need to leave, he said softly into Akutagawa's ear. The other nodded slightly and allowed him to take his hand and lead him out of the room. As they made their way down the corridor, Atsushi and Akutagawa exchanged glances that spoke volumes, their unspoken understanding filling the silence between them.